The sun dipped low over the streets of Riverton, casting warm streaks of orange and gold across the city skyline. Daniel Hayes loosened his tie as his sedan hummed quietly beneath him, the soft breeze from the air conditioning cooling the lingering weight of a long day at the office. The faint melody of jazz played on the radio, a soothing contrast to the rush of traffic winding down as evening approached. As Daniel approached an intersection, the light flickered to yellow. He eased his foot onto the brake, slowing just as the light slipped into red. But before he could exhale, the sharp flash of red and blue filled his rearview mirror. The wail of a siren followed, cutting through the calm. Daniel's brow furrowed as he guided his car to the curb, his window gliding down as the police cruiser behind him came to a stop. Out stepped Officer Marcus Bryant, mid-30s, his buzz cut neat, his uniform crisp beneath the glow of his cruiser's lights. His badge caught the sunlight, polished and gleaming as he adjusted his belt, walking toward Daniel's car with the ease of someone who had long been used to asserting authority. "License and registration," Bryant said, his tone flat but edged with a quiet demand. Daniel nodded, reaching smoothly into his glove compartment. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He retrieved the documents, offering them through the window without a word. But as Bryant took them, Daniel felt the officer's eyes linger, scanning him with a gaze that wasn't simply procedural. It was searching. "You know why I stopped you?" Bryant leaned closer, one hand resting on the edge of the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Daniel replied calmly, his voice steady and polite. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Bryant noted, though the slight hesitation in his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. Daniel frowned faintly but offered a small nod. "I thought I slowed in time, but I understand." Bryant didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered, his gaze narrowing as if the stop had transformed into something else, something more than just a traffic violation. He straightened slightly, his posture shifting, already convinced there was more to uncover. "You're not from around here, are you?" Bryant asked, glancing at Daniel's license. Daniel's hand rested lightly on the steering wheel as he answered, "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Bryant wasn't really listening. The question had been rhetorical, a thread he could pull at to see what unraveled. "Where were you headed?" Bryant continued, his tone sharpening just enough to indicate he wasn't interested in simple directions. Daniel's eyes met his. "I'm on my way home." His voice remained calm, unbothered by the officer's escalating scrutiny. But Daniel wasn't just a driver in Bryant's eyes anymore. He was something else, something suspicious. The shift was palpable, crackling in the small space between them. Bryant stepped back, folding Daniel's documents carefully, but with exaggerated slowness. The smug curl of his lips hinted that his mind had already been made up. "Step out of the vehicle for me," Bryant ordered, his hand resting near his belt. Daniel's fingers tightened briefly around the steering wheel. His expression, however, remained unreadable. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice still measured. Bryant's lips twitched, but he concealed it. "I asked you to step out. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. Daniel exhaled slowly, pulling the door handle and stepping out onto the pavement. Bryant's eyes roamed over him, taking in the sharp lines of Daniel's tailored suit, the polish on his shoes. Everything about him suggested professionalism, control, traits that only seemed to irritate Bryant more. "Hands where I can see them," Bryant instructed, gesturing toward the front of the car. Daniel complied, moving with calm precision. "Anything specific you're looking for?" Daniel asked as he placed his hands on the hood. Bryant smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had incidents around here lately. Can't be too careful." Daniel turned his head slightly, meeting Bryant's gaze. "Incidents involving men in suits driving sedans?" His words were soft, but they landed with weight. "Or does this have more to do with something else?" For a brief second, Bryant's confidence flickered. His back straightened, his hand drifting toward his belt more from habit than necessity. "Watch your tone," Bryant warned, his voice hardening. "I'm just asking a question," Daniel replied, his tone unshaken, firm but devoid of defiance. Bryant stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You seem familiar with how this works. Got something to hide?" Daniel let the silence stretch, unbothered by the question. "No, officer," he said finally. I just believe in understanding why things happen. Transparency. Bryant's eyes lingered on Daniel, but the calm, unwavering presence in front of him didn't shift, not in fear or irritation. And that, more than anything, left the officer uneasy. Forget. Daniel Hayes watched Officer Marcus Bryant's composure begin to unravel, though he masked it behind stiff movements and clipped commands. You seem pretty sure of yourself, Bryant muttered, almost as if trying to convince himself more than Daniel. Like you know what's going to happen next. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is. Bryant froze for just a moment. His hand shifted slightly away from his belt, but the stiffness in his shoulders remained. His eyes narrowed, but no words followed. The calm in Daniel's voice wasn't what Bryant had expected. There was no trembling, no nervous deflection, just poise. It wasn't defiance, but something harder to handle. Control. The silence between them stretched, tension thickening with every passing second. Bryant's jaw tensed. He didn't like the way this was going. Turn around and place your hands on the hood, Bryant ordered abruptly, his tone clipped and strained. I need to check for weapons. Daniel raised a brow. Weapons? His voice carried disbelief but not anger. Do I look like someone carrying a weapon, officer? Bryant's grip on control faltered for just a breath. I'm not going to ask again. For a moment, Daniel's gaze lingered on him, unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped to the front of his car, palms pressing flat against the hood. The sound of Bryant's boots crunching on the pavement filled the space between them. His search was quick, rougher than necessary, more about making a point than following protocol. Bryant's hands lingered just a little too long, but Daniel didn't react. No flinch, no shift. You're clean, Bryant finally muttered, stepping back as though the words themselves irritated him. Daniel straightened, turning to face him, his movements fluid. Of course I am. His voice was soft but carried weight. Now, officer, if that's all. I'm not done, Bryant cut in quickly. The rise in his voice gave him away. He wasn't ready to let go of control. You seem to know a lot about this process, Bryant continued, folding his arms as he searched Daniel's face. Care to explain why? Daniel's posture didn't change. He crossed his arms loosely, leaning slightly against the car. I've had my share of experiences with law enforcement, Daniel replied. Let's just say, I've learned a few things over the years. Bryant's eyes narrowed. Is that so? You a lawyer or something? A faint smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's mouth. Or something. The lack of clarity seemed to needle Bryant further. He stepped closer, cutting into Daniel's space, lowering his voice to a near growl. Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this? Daniel met his gaze head-on, unblinking. I don't think anything, officer. I believe in fairness, and right now I'm not seeing much of it. The words hovered between them, hanging like a quiet but firm challenge. Bryant's lips curled slightly in frustration. Fairness. You think that's what this is about? People like you always? He stopped abruptly, swallowing the rest of the sentence. But the damage was already done. Daniel's expression remained neutral, but something about the way he straightened hinted that he'd caught every unspoken word. People like me, Daniel echoed, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Bryant stiffened, stepping back, as if realizing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't undo. You know what I meant, he muttered, though his voice lacked the edge it had moments earlier. I think I do, Daniel replied. His calmness wasn't passive anymore. It was razor sharp, cutting through the facade Bryant had tried to build. And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic light a long time ago. Bryant opened his mouth, but the words refused to come. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his eyes. The balance of power was shifting, and for once, Bryant wasn't standing on solid ground. Daniel Hayes broke the silence, his voice calm but unyielding. Officer, I think it's time you knew who I am. Officer Marcus Bryant's eyes narrowed, irritation flickering back to life. I don't care who you are, he snapped, though the slight tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. Daniel's hand moved slowly toward his pocket. I'm reaching for my badge, he said evenly, watching Bryant's hand instinctively twitch closer to his holster. No need for theatrics, officer. I just want you to see it. The tension hung thick between them as Bryant's gaze followed Daniel's hand. From the pocket of his blazer, Daniel withdrew a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open with practiced ease, revealing a polished gold badge that caught the last of the evening light. "Daniel Hayes," he said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself at a dinner party. "Head of Internal Affairs, Riverton Police Department." Bryant's entire body stiffened. His eyes darted from the badge back to Daniel's face, searching for any hint that this was some elaborate trick. But there was nothing. No smirk, no hidden amusement. Just quiet authority and a trace of something Bryant wasn't used to seeing: disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Bryant repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," Daniel interjected before he could stumble further. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure those wearing this badge uphold the integrity it represents." The color drained from Bryant's face. His shoulders, squared just moments before, seemed to sag under an invisible weight. His hand fell away from his belt, as if the badge at his hip now carried a burden he hadn't noticed until that moment. Daniel stepped forward, closing the gap that Bryant unconsciously created. "Do you know the most troubling part of this interaction, Officer Bryant?" he asked, his tone cutting but calm. Bryant said nothing. He looked like a man who had wandered into quicksand without realizing it, until it was too late. "It's not the profiling," Daniel continued, folding his arms. "Though that's troubling enough. It's not even the needless escalation. It's the fact that you did all of this without knowing who you were dealing with." Bryant swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing. "That I wouldn't understand the very laws you're sworn to uphold." "And why?" Bryant opened his mouth, but no words followed. Daniel leaned in slightly, his gaze unrelenting. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect." The words weren't shouted, they weren't angry, but they carried the weight of a gavel slamming down on a courtroom bench. "And that," Daniel added, "isn't just a problem for me, it's a problem for everyone you encounter in that uniform." Bryant's shoulders sagged further, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His eyes flicked down to the badge in Daniel's hand, lingering as if hoping it might somehow disappear if he stopped looking at it. Daniel stepped back, giving Bryant just enough space to breathe. But his voice didn't lose its edge. "Here's what's going to happen," Daniel said, his words deliberate. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Bryant's lips parted, but hesitation gripped him. He lingered too long. "And," Daniel added, lowering his voice, "you're going to hear from me again. Not as the driver you stopped tonight, but as the man who decides whether you get to keep wearing that badge." A flush crept up Bryant's neck. He reached into his chest pocket with trembling hands and withdrew Daniel's license and registration. He held them out stiffly, his fingers visibly shaking. Daniel took them without a word, tucking them neatly back into his wallet. He stepped toward his car, hand resting on the door handle. Before sliding in, Daniel glanced back over his shoulder, meeting Bryant's gaze one final time. "Remember this, Officer Bryant," Daniel said. "That badge doesn't make you better than anyone, it makes you accountable to everyone." As Daniel started the engine and pulled away, Bryant remained frozen, the flashing lights from his cruiser illuminating his face. His confidence, so absolute just moments before, was gone, replaced by something more uncertain. But for Daniel, the encounter was far from over. The drive home was silent, save for the hum of the tires on asphalt. The interaction replayed in Daniel's mind, not because it was extraordinary, but because it wasn't. Officer Bryant wasn't the first, and Daniel knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time was different. This time, Daniel had the power to do something. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds of Daniel's office at the Riverton Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A manila folder lay open on his desk. The name on the file, Marcus Bryant. Daniel leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he reviewed the contents. Minor complaints, unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, vague misunderstandings that had been brushed aside time and time again. Bryant wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeper issue. And Daniel wasn't interested in applying band-aids. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Claire, stepped in holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Hayes. I've got the summary of last month's cases. Chief Wallace also asked me to remind you about the oversight meeting next week." Daniel nodded, taking the files. "Thank you, Claire. Also, schedule me a meeting with the chief this afternoon." Claire hesitated, sensing the weight behind his request. "Of course," she said quietly before leaving the office. Daniel's eyes drifted back to Bryant's file. His focus, however, wasn't just on one officer. This wasn't about one man. It was about the culture that allowed him to thrive. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat across from Chief Warren in a small, sunlit conference room. Warren, a no-nonsense veteran with sharp eyes and graying hair, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as he listened. Daniel recounted the traffic stop, his voice even but firm. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Daniel said, closing the file on the table. "But that would have been a mistake. Bryant's behavior isn't isolated, it's a reflection of deeper cracks in the department." Warren exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "This isn't the first time Bryant's name has crossed my desk," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally." "And that's the problem," Daniel replied without hesitation. "Quiet fixes nothing. Quiet lets it fester. It's time to be loud." The weight of Daniel's words settled heavily between them. "What are you suggesting?" Warren asked, his brow creasing. "A department-wide review, not just of individual officers, but our entire system. Training, protocols, accountability measures. We can't keep sweeping these things under the rug. If we don't demand higher standards from ourselves, how can the community trust us to protect them?" Warren leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "Good," he said simply. "It's about time someone did." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Daniel's calendar filled with meetings, interviews, and endless stacks of reports. He compiled data, conducted one-on-one sessions with officers, and held community forums to hear directly from the people affected by department missteps. The Bryant incident, which could have been swept aside, became a turning point, a catalyst that forced the department to confront uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, Bryant faced an internal hearing. Daniel made no effort to stay hidden. He sat across from Bryant during the proceedings, watching as the officer shifted uncomfortably under the weight of scrutiny. Bryant's confidence cracked under the relentless questions, and by the end, the ruling was clear: suspension. But Daniel knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Bryant. It was in ensuring there wouldn't be another Bryant. Months later, Daniel found himself standing at a podium, the bright lights overhead illuminating a crowded community hall. The audience was a blend of officers, city officials, and local residents. Some faces were skeptical, others hopeful. Daniel cleared his throat, letting the room quiet before he spoke. "This isn't about blame," he began, his voice steady. "It's about responsibility. We are tasked with a duty: to serve, to protect, and to uphold the values of justice. But that duty isn't just to the people we arrest. It's to the people we work alongside and the communities we stand within." Eyes locked on him, Daniel pressed forward. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," he continued, his words resonating through the hall. "It's about ensuring those who wear this badge do so with integrity, fairness, and respect. For everyone. No exceptions." Daniel paused for just a breath, scanning the faces in the crowd. "That's the badge I believe in," he said, his voice firm. "And that's the badge we're building together, starting today." Applause erupted around the room, but Daniel didn't linger in the praise. For him, this wasn't the conclusion. It was the start of something far more important. As he stepped down from the podium, Daniel caught the gaze of Chief Warren standing near the back. Warren gave a slight nod of approval, but Daniel knew there was more work ahead. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen. And for now, that was enough.